The Institute for Social Research, aka the Frankfurt School, Aufheben der Kultur, Negate the Culture. Contemporary discussions of the left can have a way of looking like a kabuki of totems that runs on a collective body of borrowed knowledge that displaces actual awareness. They run on the surface of events, barely cover the depth demanded of a tweet, and are sclerotic. One simply invokes totem-like either Alinsky or the Frankfurt School for reification of talking points that are invariably used in a manner that disassociates Alinsky or the Frankfurt School from the dialectically driven Marxism that informs them. As such, strategeries directed against the left operate on a pseudo-reality of surface narratives structured to be under-inclusive to actual events and, hence, are incapable of supporting effective decision-making. Current opposition narratives generated to oppose the left, in fact the very way the left is discussed, are permissible under controlled opposition regimes because they cannot generate real traction outside the pseudo-reality. It is with this sense of an underestimated understanding of the Frankfurt School that this discussion proceeds. From its founding in 1923 as the Institute for Social Research at Goethe University in Frankfurt, Germany, the Frankfurt School has expressly self-identified as Marxist. The Frankfurt School is generally credited with claims of originality for developing critical theory, its full leveraging of sexual lines of effort, and its tactic of progressing through the production, manipulation, and enforcement of narratives. Yet, even as Ralph de Toledano relied on Wilhelm Willy Munzenberg's statement that, quote, "We must organize the intellectuals and use them to make Western civilization stink. Only then, after they have corrupted all its values and made life base, can we impose the dictatorship of the proletariat," unquote. To provide the Frankfurt School with its mission statement, quote, "The aim of the Frankfurt School was to destroy Western civilization and its culture, and in the chaos and moral anarchy that followed, to create a totally new social and moral order derived from neo-Marxism and neo-Freudianism, both of which would be the tools to make the Judeo-Christian basis of Western civilization stink, as Willy Munzenberg had vowed," unquote. It must be noted that Munzenberg was not a member of the Frankfurt School. Rather, he was associated with the Communist International, Comintern, was a Soviet asset, at least early on, and was a leading member of the Communist Party of Germany, the KPD. Munzenberg's nihilist call for the targeted destruction of Western civilization was universal to all Marxists, going back to Marx himself. On Munzenberg's mobilizing of the intellectuals, that process was likewise well advanced, as Julian Benda's 1927 The Treason of the Intellectuals attests. On sexual license as a line of effort, the 1920s Soviet-initiated era of forced sexual license and the Nazi brown shirt's decadence was notorious. Of course, scientized enforcement narratives can not only be traced back to Marx's own Wissenschaft Sozialismus, scientific socialism. It also comprised major lines of effort for both the Comintern and the Comintern-directed CPUSA, from Belladot in 1953. Quote, "There are two phases of life that communists take over. One is control over money, and two is control over words, language. They are fast taking over all the nice words, all the nice language of the Christian world, and they are taking them to themselves and giving them new connotation, so that when they talk to the world they are saying one thing, which is understood by their followers, but to our ears it sounds like the things which we should be saying," unquote. If anything, Frankfurt School initiatives reflected a rebalancing from the revolutionary emphasis of the Marxist-Leninism of the Soviet Union, especially as Stalin rose to power. In the alternative, it can also be understood to be a reversion to Marxism's main effort, penetration and subversion of the West in pursuit of pure negation. Yet, while it may be true that the Frankfurt School offered nothing new, it also remains true that it elevated enforceable narratives and sex to major points of emphasis. In doing so, it re-emphasized the original Marx, that is, Marx OS version 1.0. Recall that critical theory has its roots in the critical philosophy Marx introduced in 1843 in Letter from Marx to Arnold Rouge in Dresden. Likewise, the Frankfurt notion of proletariat reflects Marx's original use of the term as a middle class, quote, heralding the dissolution of the hereto existing world order, a proletariat that merely proclaims the secret of its own existence, for it is the factual dissolution of that world order, unquote. Consistent with Marx, the original archetype proletariat has always been dedicated to the destruction of society, with the working class proletariat being but a later line of effort. The Frankfurt School consciously understood itself to be closest to Marx at precisely the point where Marx was closest to Hegel. Critical theory is purposely Hegelian. While Herbert Marcuse used the term Aufhebender Kultur in 1937, it is generally recognized to have come from Georg Lukács at about the time he wrote Who Will Save Us from Western Civilization in the early 1920s. Georg Lukács. Lukács was not only a founding member of the Frankfurt School in 1919, for the 5 murderous months of its existence, he was also the Minister of Culture for the Hungarian Soviet Republic under Bela Kun. A purely Hegelian concept, Aufhebender Kultur, negate the culture, calls for the negation of Western culture along dialectical lines using Hegelian formulas of negation. Lukács recognized the Hegel in Marx, and likewise communicated his Marxism along those same lines. From his 1920 The Old Culture and the New Culture, Lukács wrote, quote, in the last analysis, the communist social order means the aufhebung of the economy as an end in itself. This is all the more true because this side of the transformation, the aufhebung of the economy as an end in itself, cannot express itself in the surface appearances of life after the seizure of power. Domination over the economy, that is what the socialist economy is, means the aufhebung of the autonomy of the economy, with the aufhebung of human isolation and of anarchic individualism. Human society will form an organic whole. Its parts, individual members and products, will support and magnify each other in the service of the common goal, the idea of further human development, unquote. When saying, quote, with the aufhebung of human isolation and anarchic individualism, human society will form an organic whole, unquote, Lukács is conforming his concept of society to the Hegelian notion that particulars can only have meaning in the context of the whole, which only manifests itself imperfectly until the end of history, when the whole fully manifests as absolute act. As such, individual identity only truly exists in the context of the whole, which the vanguard of the proletariat works diligently to facilitate. Closely read, one can also discern in the aufhebung of the economy as an end in itself that Lukács was only interested in the destruction of the existing order. To emphasize the Hegelian basis for his economic theories, Lukács would later write The Young Hegel. Consistent with Marx and Negate, Lukács was driven by the same libido dominandi, the will to destroy. As early as 1910, and then in 1915, Lukács wrote, quote, I saw the revolutionary destruction of society as the one and only solution to the cultural contradictions of the epoch. Unquote. Quote, all the social forces I had hated since my youth, and which I aimed in spirit to annihilate, now came together to unleash the first global war. At the same time, they were globally without any ideas, the very enemies of ideas. Right from the beginning, I was among the negative forces. Unquote. Max Horkheimer. So close are the Frankfurt School writings to the Hegelian formulas, translators felt compelled to write translators' notes to explain their treatment of Hegelian terms in translation. Because it is not possible to understand critical theory outside the Hegelian dialectic, it is also not possible to understand the Frankfurt School outside of it either. The will to destroy is by no means limited to Lukács or to the 1920s. In a 1969 German TV interview, Max Horkheimer said, quote, "Marx has not seen at all that freedom and justice are dialectical concepts. The more freedom, the less justice, and the more justice, the less freedom. The reason for the critical theory, which I also developed later, is the thought that what is good, a good, free society, cannot be created in the society in which we're currently living. We have shortcomings concerning that, but we can address the negative sides of this society, which we want to change," unquote. Because a good, free society cannot be created in this society, it must be negated to make way for one that can, at least in the eyes of Frankfurt imaginators. Horkheimer was a past director and founding member of the Frankfurt School. When reading his comments, note that dialectical concepts relate to establishing a dialectical relationship between freedom and justice that results in their negation, Aufheben, to a higher level synthesis along purely Hegelian lines. Recall that negation negates, that the difference between Hegel and Marx is that Marx understood the destructive nihilism of the dialectic, and that the resulting synthesis of freedom and justice is the forced negation of both. Also, note the arbitrary juxtaposition of freedom with justice, such that a negation process will result in a predetermined outcome calculated to diminish both. All of it is so scientific, but only in terms of imposing a pseudoscience, a metaphysic. The same holds for Horkheimer's addressing, quote, the negative sides of society, unquote. Whatever Marxists determine the negative side of society to be, once identified as such, it will be opposed by its antithetical, positive side, a liberating side, in a series of negations, Aufheben, structured to reduce that society to incoherence. Aufheben der Kultur. Horkheimer continues, quote, criticism of the society, yes, but a call to revolution, absolutely not. After National Socialism is overcome, a revolution would likely result in a dictatorship again. And I believe that what we have to be against is that the, even if still very uncertain, development towards the globally governed world wouldn't happen through catastrophe and dictatorship, unquote. For Horkheimer, criticism of society, critical theory criticism of society, simply means imposing critical theory processes to all aspects of society through as many lines of effort as it takes. Critical theory is simply the relentless reduction of Western civilization through a systematic series of negations that applies the Hegelian dialectic in support of Marxist objectives understood in nihilist terms. This is the same critical philosophy Marx first articulated in his letter to Rouge when writing of the, quote, ruthless criticism of the existing order, unquote, in which, quote, we do not anticipate the world with our dogmas, but instead attempt to discover the new world through the critique of the old, unquote, that, as we shall see, is very much with us today. As with the Frankfurt School generally, Horkheimer believed the best way to achieve global governance is through the slow, controlled subversion of societies through a long-term series of tailored Hegelian negations along targeted lines of effort. In this, Aufheben der Kultur is to be preferred over the unpredictable volatility of revolution. While the Frankfurt School's preference for penetration and subversion over revolution remains, the Menshevik over the Bolshevik, it is still Marxism and is hence still controlled by a nihilist libido dominandi, will to power. On the application of critical theory, Horkheimer noted that, quote, there are not only moments which have to be overcome at any price, but also moments about which we think should be kept." Unquote. When stating that, as a matter of prioritization, quote, negation, Aufhebung, of the societal relations which are slowing down progress is indeed to be the next historical goal, unquote. Yet even so, in affirmation of the nihilist intent of the dialectic, Horkheimer is clear that this phase of critical theory is only concerned with the negating acts of destruction, not the outcome, that critical theory only, quote, wants to designate what has to be overcome, überwunden, without entering the speculation about the end result, unquote. Of course, critical theory will never leave the negation phase because that is all it does, because that is all it is designed to do. Horkheimer is then asked whether it is the question of the levels of destruction that separate him from Herbert Marcuse, drawing the distinction between evils in a society that are abuses and a society that is in itself evil. Horkheimer puts Marcuse squarely on the side of those who think the current society is, in itself, evil and hence, quote, should be destroyed, unquote. Or, as Marcuse stated in 1937 while living in America, the goal was Aufheben der Kultur. Perhaps sensing the expectancies of the interviewer, Horkheimer then immediately tried to mitigate the harshness of his own views on Marcuse. Referring to Marcuse's concepts of repressive tolerance, Horkheimer spoke hypothetically for Marcuse, suggesting that maybe today Marcuse would say, no, some aspects of the current culture should be kept. Even so, Horkheimer maintains that, even if Marcuse might keep some of today's culture, he is still further down on the continuum that calls for total destruction because he, as Horkheimer says, quote, cannot imagine any situation, any societal situation, where there's not repression, unquote. In saying this, Horkheimer was paraphrasing from Marcuse's 1965 Repressive Tolerance, which states, quote, the author is fully aware that, at present, no power, no authority, no government exists which would translate liberating tolerance into practice, unquote. Quote, such a society does not yet exist anywhere, unquote. In the dialectical paradigm, when such a society does not exist anywhere, it is the same as saying that the current society must be negated for one that will. Living in America at the time, this means that Marcuse believed that America must be negated. This is academically concealed sedition. While a different imaginator of a different second reality, Marcuse's worker's paradise is Hegel's realized Philosophia Perennis. See Appendix B. Apparently, Herbert Marcuse had the reputation among fellow Frankfurt cadre for taking a nihilistic hardline, since no society exists today that can provide Marcuse's liberating tolerance. They must all be Aufheben, past tense, negated. Herbert Marcuse. Before going further, a little background on Marcuse is in order. Herbert Marcuse joined the Institute in Geneva in 1933 and came over to Columbia University in 1934 with the rest of the Frankfurt cohort, becoming a U.S. citizen in 1940. Hence, when Marcuse joined the U.S. War Department's Office of War Information in the Bureau of Intelligence in 1942, he'd already put in 9 years of Frankfurt school service. By March 1943, Marcuse was transferred to the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS. At the conclusion of World War II, Marcuse's OSS functions were transferred to the State Department, where he directed the Central European section of the Office of Intelligence Research from 1945 to 1951, all the while an avowed Marxist committed to Aufheben der Kultur during the formative years of the Cold War. While a few sources point out that he was fluent in Russian and an expert in Soviet affairs in conjunction with his tenure at the State Department, Others simply note that when he left his 9 years of intelligence service, it was as a research fellow at Columbia's Russian Institute and then at Harvard University's Russian Research Center. Leaving government service, Marcuse taught at Columbia from 1952 to 1953, at Harvard University from 1954 to 1955, at Brandeis University in Massachusetts from 1954 to 1965, and finally at the University of California at San Diego from 1965 until his retirement in 1976. While Marcuse was a prolific writer, treatment here will be limited to establishing the dialectical nature of Marcuse's repressive tolerance in furtherance of explaining its dialectical design. Repressive tolerance weaponized critical theory for use against America and the West. For Marcuse, the repressive tolerance of America was, and still is, in need of negation by a liberating tolerance. Der amerikanische Kultur muss aufgehoben werden. As with Horkheimer and Lukács, Marcuse's Marxism was purposely Hegelian. While still in Germany, Marcuse studied under Martin Heidegger. In 1932, he wrote a PhD-level thesis, Hegel's Ontology and the Theory of Historicity. In 1941, while on staff at the Institute for Social Research at Columbia University, he famously wrote Reason and Revolution. The full name of the monograph is Reason and Revolution, Hegel and the Rise of Modern Social Theory. In 1965, he wrote Repressive Tolerance. Repressive tolerance lays out the operational design of Marxist critical theory applied to America. Marcuse did this through the arbitrary division of tolerance into two forms, liberating and repressive, for the purpose of subjecting tolerance to a dialectical process of negation. Under Marcuse's regime, universal tolerance becomes intolerance to non-conforming particular views. When Marcuse stated in the second paragraph of Repressive Tolerance that he was, quote, fully aware that, at present, no power, no authority, no government exists which would translate liberating tolerance into practice, unquote, he was declaring that America, along with its Western Judeo-Christian culture, was repressive and, hence, rightfully the object of negation, precisely because it was Western and Judeo-Christian. With his full explanation, one can see the dialectical intent of Aufheben. Quote, the ironical question, who educates the educators, i.e. the political leaders, also applies to democracy, the only authentic alternative and negation of dictatorship. With respect to this question, would be a society in which the people had become autonomous individuals, freed from the repressive requirements of a struggle for existence in the interest of domination, and as such, human beings choosing their government and determining their life. Such a society does not yet exist anywhere, unquote. Adding a touch of Freud, Marcuse explains the negation of repressive tolerance in psychological terms, where negation takes the form of a sublimation that involves an ongoing series of negations that lead to a self-actualization which, unfortunately, quote, weakens the necessity and power of the intellect, unquote. Dumbing down, Marcuse's discussion of sublimation in the context of psychological concerns places his assessment squarely in the Hegelian domain of subjective spirit. For Hegel, psychology is one of the three components of subjective spirit. As Meiji explains, Hegel treats subjectivity in all its forms as a progressive attempt by the subject to annul the otherness of the object and make it its own. For example, our feelings tell us how the world ought to be and induces us to try and change it, but the world continually frustrates these feelings. Practical spirit thus cannot truly negate the otherness of the other. Free spirit, the third and final subdivision of psychology, involves the subject understanding all the preceding as the necessary condition of its development. Only civilized society can compel us to sublimate, and channel our drives in order that we may realize our human potential. Hegel's dialectic therefore turns from subjective spirit to objective spirit. It is not wrong to see in Hegel's treatment of subjective spirit and psychology an element of what today many consider to be New Age thinking. Returning to the strange in Hegel, Marcuse uses Freud to reintegrate those aspects of Hegel broken off from Marxism in the early development of dialectical materialism. It's the neo in the Frankfurt School's neo-Marxism. One need only read the 2 extended footnotes, Marcuse's explanation of negation through sublimation and Meiji's explanation of Hegel's subjective spirit, to see the parallels. It may also be worth revisiting scientism as an imposed metaphysic and then consider Karl Popper's concern for the non-falsifiability of the psychoanalysis of his time regarding Freud, especially in light of the alchemical nature of Jung's psychoanalysis. It is with this understanding of the mechanics of repressive tolerance's dialectical off-haven that one can see that it is necessarily directed against America and the American way of life. Marcuse calls for subversion, undemocratic means, and the suspension of the First Amendment in furtherance of implementing a postmodern campaign of otherisms based on racism, discrimination, etc. When reading Frankfurt School materials, the right and fascism should be understood to mean anything that is either not from the left or is something about which the left disagrees. From Repressive Tolerance, quote, "The conclusion reached is that the realization of the objective of tolerance would call for intolerance toward prevailing policies, attitudes, opinions, and the extension of tolerance to policies, attitudes, and opinions which are outlawed or suppressed." Unquote. Quote, "Surely no government can be expected to foster its own subversion, but in a democracy such a right is vested in the people, i.e., the majority of the people. This means that the way should not be blocked on which a subversive majority could develop, and if they are blocked by organized repression and indoctrination, their reopening may require apparently undemocratic means. They would include the withdrawal of toleration of speech and assembly from groups and movements which promote aggressive policies, armament, chauvinism, discrimination on the grounds of race and religion, or which oppose the extension of public services, social security, medical care, etc." Unquote. Quote, "Liberating tolerance, then, would mean intolerance against movements from the right and toleration of movements from the left. As to the scope of this tolerance and intolerance, it would extend to the stage of action as well as of discussion and propaganda, of deed as well as of word." Unquote. Closely paralleling Marcuse's academically neutral manner of explaining repressive tolerance, Mao's 1949 statement from "On the People's Democratic Dictatorship" provides some insight and warning as to where repressive tolerance is intended to lead. Quote, "Under the leadership of the working class and the Communist Party, these classes, the people, unite together to form their own state and elect their own government, so as to carry out a dictatorship over the lackeys of imperialism. These 2 aspects, namely, democracy among the people and dictatorship over the reactionaries, combine to form the people's democratic dictatorship. To the hostile classes, the state apparatus is the instrument of oppression. It is violent and not benevolent. Our benevolence applies only to the people, and not to the reactionary act of the reactionaries and reactionary classes outside the people." Unquote. Mao Zedong, 1949. Simply stated, as with Mao, for Marcuse, the Frankfurt School, Marxists, and the neo-Marxist left, all people and organizations who associated with repressive tolerance are to be designated as not being of the people, and hence should not be afforded the rights of a person as if they were. They are non-persons. The facially neutral manner in which the American left expresses its otherwise hardcore Marxist intent must be accounted for precisely because it is so disarming. When speaking of building a quote-unquote subversive majority, It should not be lost on the reader that Marcuse was calling for a current minority to subvert the will of the majority. Hence, the statement that political correctness is the enforcement mechanism of postmodern narratives that implements cultural Marxism speaks directly to the negation engine Marcuse's repressive tolerance put in motion that today culminates in hate speech narratives. Political correctness is a neo-Marxist line of effort. It is also an existential threat. Because the political warfare component of this assessment will focus on dialectical attacks at the national level, this discussion will focus on the foreign nature of these narratives to suggest that, as embedded as they have become, they are hostile and alien to American understandings of the rule of law and to constitutional principles because they are dialectical constructs known to be structured to negate them. Marcuse's repressive tolerance, the language of international forums. Using the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe's Human Dimension Implementation Meetings, OSCE HDIM, as a benchmark, it is apparent that the language of international human rights has functionally transitioned to neo-Marxist memes by the very margin by which they conform to Marcuse's tolerance standards. It is clear that they substantially conform. In the 2018 annotated agenda for the HDIM meetings in Warsaw, the document speaks of commitment to, quote, the protection of fundamental freedoms, human rights, and the rule of law, unquote, including, quote, freedom of expression, unquote, over 120 times. Yet, in May 2015, in Vienna, Austria, an OSCE panel at a formal OSCE function went on record as stating that something known to be true could nonetheless constitute hate speech. Leading up to the 2018 HDIM conference in Warsaw, Poland, the OSCE released a new Code of Conduct stating that participants shall refrain from saying anything that might be, quote, discriminating to other persons on the basis of their race, color, sex, language, religion, or belief, political or other opinion, national or social origin, property, birth, or other status, unquote, and that, quote, infractions could lead to a person being ejected from the forum, unquote. Because the OSCE standard is based on how someone feels, and given the all-enveloping nature of the list of possible infractions just listed, the list should be understood to be structured to suspend repressively tolerant speech, which becomes any speech the OSCE arbitrarily deems discriminating, or maybe not so arbitrary. In fact, may be systematic. In this, it should not be lost on readers that this discriminatory standard operates in parallel with Islamophobia criteria stated in fascially neutral language when used in those same international forums. It is with a situational awareness of Marcuse's liberating tolerance that one should understand the OSCE's freedom of expression canons when assessing the selected topics for the 2018 HDIM meetings, with such labels as, quote, freedom of the media, combating racism, xenophobia, intolerance, and discrimination, and the rights of migrants, unquote. 53 years after repressive tolerance, the OSCE tracks with Marcuse's original language, calling for the, quote, withdrawal of toleration of speech and assembly from groups and movements which promote aggressive policies, armament, chauvinism, discrimination on the grounds of race and religion, unquote. It should come as no surprise that which Marxist critical theory seeks to negate is synonymous with what is identified as repressively tolerant in societies that then must be targeted for Aufheben, and that these have always been what Marxists have always sought to destroy. Hence, repressive speech is axiomatically hate speech, the objects of which have always been targeted for suppression. Because repressive tolerance encompasses all things American, a defense of America likewise, axiomatically, constitutes hate speech, or will at some point. It is not just that hate speech canons are an un-American assault on First Amendment principles. It's that they are the antithetical negation of those principles positioned in a classic Hegelian process that seeks the Aufhebender Kultur of America in just the way privileges granted by the state negates rights endowed by the Creator. Social justice negates justice. Rights of the migrant negate rights of citizens. Interfaith negates faith. The soft science of gender negates the hard science, biological fact, of sex. They all demand that 2 + 2 = 5, based on the scientism of imposed metaphysics, especially among those they know better. On this last point, from a real human rights perspective, one need look no further than decisions to deprive children of their biological rights through gender reassignment to recognize the actual destruction of their true human rights that goes unacknowledged by our conservative guardians that are protecting what rights at what gate. Their deafening silence makes a mockery of the true civil and human rights they took oaths to defend. The Marxist destruction goes beyond Hegelian. It's alien. Just note how OSCE publications on hate speech and related topics are co-published in Russian. Of note, OSCE and related international forums speak favorably of how they work with American social media to adopt European Union hate speech standards, which have Islamic speech codes subsumed in them through facially neutral hate speech regimes. To get an idea for the immediacy of this issue, one need look no further than the European Court of Human Rights October 25, 2018 decision that critical statements about Islam or Muhammad, quote, do not fall under the purview of free speech, unquote, and that such a decision, quote, serves the legitimate aim of preserving religious peace, unquote. To the extent that this standard is brought to America, when an American social media entity limits an American's access to social media inside the United States, why aren't those social media concerns seen as acting under color of foreign authority when imposing foreign speech laws on American citizens inside the United States in contravention of their First Amendment rights? This is but one example of the devastating effects when the institutional voices of quote-unquote mainstream and quote-unquote conservative opposition to the left amount to little more than a controlled opposition stuck on liberal. Liberating tolerances, itemized as others, and positioned to negate the repressive. When turning to otherism in the context of repressive tolerance, it is important to bear in mind the negating role of critical theory, that negation only negates, that it is not capable of building up, and that, from Marx to Marcuse, the concern has never extended beyond the desire to tear down as an expression of Voglin's libido dominandi. Hence, recognition of genuine concern for issues of equality and fair treatment concerning race, sex, religion, et al. Is inconsistent with their use in a dialectical process that only seeks their exploitation when used to negate a target population or value, because there can be no genuine expectation of this process resulting in the improvement of the class being exploited, because improvement has never been the intent. With America as the repressively tolerant regime, wherever there is an other with a competing value, that value will be scored as holding a liberating tolerance value that will then be pitted against the American value in a dialectical process of Aufheben. The dialectical process will use the other to generate as many liberating values as there are American values to be destroyed, with as many dialectical turns as it takes. Hence, because it is repressively tolerant to identify as an American, racism will negate this. Love America, xenophobia will negate this. Secure the border, the rights of migrants will negate this. Believe that the Constitution is the supreme law of the land, Fascism will negate this as the dialectically determined living constitution subversively hollows it out. As important, if American institutions of higher learning were built by immigrants of European stock, white privilege will negate this. If you are biologically male and call yourself a man, or female and a woman, genderism will negate this. The neo-Marxist attack is a complete attack on identity that intentionally violates the laws of identity. From the European Union to open society to Antifa, a common narrative arises, while otherism strategies establish a dialectical antithesis in anticipation of negation. The otherism strategy developed by Marxists to destroy America focuses on the systematic destruction of identity, leading to the complete and systematic disenfranchisement of Americans from America. It has nothing to do with the other. A classic dialectical negation along Hegelian lines, it is also a not so clear and yet very present danger that will succeed if not countered. This analysis isn't suggesting that this is a way to understand the left. It is stating that it is the only way to understand the left, and that it is one, Marxist, and two, dialectically driven. Frankfurt joins the Long March. Recognizing the role of subversion and repressive tolerance, Marcuse expanded this view in Counter-Revolution and Revolt in 1972, when envisioning the use of college and university campuses as bases of operation for counterstate activities. Quote, "The dominion of this democracy still leaves room for the building of autonomous local bases. The increasing technological scientific requirements of production and control make the universities into such a base, first for the system itself, as training schools for its cadres, but also, on the same grounds, schools for the education of future counter-cadres." Unquote. Counter-cadres exist for counter-states. Marcuse goes on to say that from the college campuses, networks can be extended into the government and the various business sectors, where students who will be future employees become competent in their line of work as they build up a network of interactive, interlocking counterstate operations. Quote, "From the campuses, it has its own base in the infrastructure itself. Moreover, this base extends from the campuses to the economic and political institutions where educated labor is needed in furtherance of the new scientific revolution that will be part of the social revolution, in which the Long March includes the concerted effort to build up counter-institutions." Unquote. This is not new. Decades earlier, in the 1930s, and along different lines of effort, Belladot engaged in establishing counterstate operations at the direction of the Comintern. That Marcuse's reference to the Long March echoes Chairman Mao's Long March retreats of the 1930s is not accidental. Marcuse's Counter-Revolution and Revolt was written, at least in part, to affirm and adopt Rudi Dutschke's strategy. Dutschke was the German Gramsci Marxist who, in 1969, coined the phrase "Long March through the institutions" in recognition of the insurgency model Mao perfected that Dutschke planned to emulate, proclaiming that, quote, "revolutionary science is possible only within the anti-authoritarian movement," unquote. Dutschke stated, quote, "Our historically correct limitation of our action to the university should not be made into a fetish. A revolutionary dialectic of the correct transitions must regard the long march through the institutions as a practical and critical action in all social spheres. It must set as its goal the subversive, critical deepening of the contradictions, a process which has been made possible in all institutions that participate in the organization of day-to-day life." Unquote. Reading Dutschke, Marcuse agreed that a political warfare approach focusing on penetration, subversion, and counterstate activity should be the way ahead, As Marcuse affirmed, quote, to extend the base of the student movement, Rudy Duschke has proposed the strategy of the long march through the institutions, working against the established institutions while working in them, but not simply by boring from within, rather, by doing the job. Unquote. As this discussion of the Frankfurt School winds down, we find that critical theory is classical Marxism dedicated to penetration and subversion that relies on dialectical processes to achieve its objectives. 1. It seeks the destruction of Western culture. 2. It is focused on an Aufhebender Kultur strategy based on otherism that is nothing more than the targeted applications of negation at the cultural level. 3. It is fully integrated into larger political warfare efforts. Noting that the reemergence of radical groups like Antifa can be traced back to Comintern programs of the 1930s, there is nothing new about the events we are witnessing today. What is new is the suppression of our collective memory of the history of these movements, leading to responses that misfire precisely because we do not recognize them. From beginning to end, it is dialectically driven Marxism. The strange, leveraging psychoanalysis. As noted, Marcuse relied on Freud to import notions of psychology that more closely map to Hegel's use of the term when discussing the subjective spirit. When Frankfurt scholars contrive along psycho-Marxist lines, one notices a recurring theme that places Western man in a fallen state in need of critical negation to restore him to a recovered, pristine state. The strange comes into play when considering the cosmological, even theological, nature of such thinking among avowed atheist Marxists. However, it is through reference to Freud that the Hermetic pattern, the Praetia Theologia, the Philosophia Perennis, the time when race, gender, and nationality were all contained in a primitive state of nature, if not an androgyne, unity of opposites, is imported into Marxist critical theory while remaining silent on the archetype form. If the process of moving to the perfected end of history, the Marxist march of history, concerns the actualization of the perfected recollected form, then the process demands a convergence to that form, often expressed in terms of a restoration or return, yet never far from the pre-reflective thoughts of the Frankfurt cadre. Eros and sex linger in a peculiar and peculiarly linked way. Quote, I know that what you call God really exists, but not in the form you think. God is primal cosmic energy, the love in your body, your integrity, and your perception of nature in you and outside you. Unquote. Wilhelm Reich. Listen, little man. Quote, the unity and congruity of culture and nature, work and love, morality and sexuality, longed for from time immemorial, will remain a dream as long as man continues to condemn the biological demand for natural sexual gratification. Unquote. Wilhelm Reich, The Function of the Orgasm, Discovery of the Orgon. Quote, I do not believe that to be religious in the best, authentic sense, a man has to destroy his love life and mummify himself, body and soul. Unquote. Wilhelm Reich, Listen, little man. Quote, the scope of man's desires and the instrumentalities for their gratification are thus immeasurably increased, and his ability to alter reality consciously in accordance with what is useful seems to promise a gradual removal of the extraneous barriers to his gratification. Unquote. Herbert Marcuse, Eros and Civilization. Quote, the concept of man that emerges from Freudian theory is the most irrefutable indictment of Western civilization and at the same time the most unshakable defense of this civilization. Unquote. Herbert Marcuse, Eros and Civilization. Quote, polymorphous sexuality was the term which I used to indicate that the new direction of progress would depend completely on the opportunity to activate repressed or arrested organic, biological needs, to make the human body an instrument of pleasure rather than labor." Unquote. Herbert Marcuse, Political Preface, Eros and Civilization. Quote, "Nothing is true in psychoanalysis, except its exaggerations." Unquote. Theodore Adorno, Minima Moralia. This excursion into the dubious literary obsessions of the Frankfurt cadre would be pointless if not for the fact that these ideations have a way of coming into play in the contemporary political landscape. Two examples, one concerning Wilhelm Reich and the other Max Horkheimer, will demonstrate a darkness to the Frankfurt School's psychosexual worldview and suggest that it has translated into Marxist lines of effort that we confront today. When assessing Reich and Horkheimer, it is important to remember that critical theory is only concerned with tearing down. It does not include a plan to actually build up anything, and seeks to aufheben die Kultur through all lines of operation, including those involving personal, family, and sexual relations. As such, consideration should be given to the possibility that Reich and Horkheimer adopt positions that are purposefully antithetical to healthy relationships because they are designed to negate what it deems to have been repressively tolerated. Particularly in these scenarios, from Marx to Alinsky, Marxists make a point of professing enmity to God while swearing allegiance to Satan in some form. Whether or not such theatrical commentary constitutes an actual relationship as professed is beyond the scope of this assessment. It is enough to point out that they indicate a state of mind that willfully seeks a nihilistic pleasure in the destruction of others for its own purpose. They want to be seen as evil, and that's good enough. Wilhelm Reich. Please take note, this section on Wilhelm Reich goes into a few unseemly details of his life. They are included because they help frame an awareness of the backgrounds of those involved in the formation of neo-Marxist sex and gender politics. Wilhelm Reich was among the early Freudian Marxists. The Marxist Internet Archive places Reich in the Frankfurt School along with Erich Fromm in 1932, while Norman Levine states that while he may not have been, quote, an actual member of the Frankfurt School, he shared the same intellectual purposes as critical theory, unquote. Marcuse credits Reich for breaking ground on topics he further developed in Eros and Civilization. Erich Fromm preferred Reich's position on genital character, the, quote, liberating effects of non-repressed genital sexuality and matriarchal theory, unquote. As such, Wilhelm Reich was among the groundbreaking minds of Freudian Marxism associated with the Frankfurt School. So what do we know about Reich? From a very early age, he was, to say the least, sexually obsessed. As early as age 5, Reich would seek sex from the maids, with some success, had a neurotic fixation with the genitals of barn animals, routinely masturbated a mare, and consorted with prostitutes, beginning at the age of 15. We know this because he wrote of it in his autobiography. He was also a chronic masturbator. From Myron Sheriff's biography of Reich, we know that when Reich published his first professional article, The Breakthrough of the Incest Taboo in Puberty, he was referring to himself when relating that, at age 12, he spied on and then caught his mother in an affair, strongly considered blackmailing her into having sex, reported her activity to his father, leading to her suicide. This is the man who, dare I say, had a seminal influence on Frankfurt School ideations on psychoanalysis relating to sexuality. It should raise a few red flags, yet, to this day, Reich's work continues to inform the left, even as his psychoanalytical theories are disfavored. From Ralph de Toledano on Reich, quote, "Children who pray do not masturbate," Reich famously wrote. "Children who masturbate do not pray." Masturbation, therefore, served as double purpose, sexual and anti-religious. But masturbation was not conceived simply as a sex expression. Along with lesbianism, it became a part of the feminist mystique to be encouraged and upgraded. Also along with it, feminists, influenced by the teachings of Kurt Lewin and other neo-Freudian neo-Marxists, promoted pornography, creating a multi-million-dollar industry for pornographic videotapes, vibrators, and other sex toys. They taught that pornography led to the emancipation of women who no longer had to participate with males for sexual gratification, and that masturbation was a concomitant to feminism. Enter cybersex. As one woman disciple of Reichian philosophy wrote of pornography, it uproots traditional female roles of passivity, creates emotional confusions, stimulates introspection, and presents a world without nuclear family. It represents sex as revolution, and vibrators, another Reichian and feminist woman author wrote, makes female orgasm as quick, easily reproducible, and simple as any male orgasm, ever. They are machines of revolution. Unquote. The Return of Max Horkheimer. Not just Reich. In 1944, Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno published the Dialectic of Enlightenment, philosophical fragments, that included Excursus II, Juliet or Enlightenment and Morality. In German, the word for enlightenment is Aufklärung. There is the observation that Horkheimer was playing with the word Aufklärung because it not only refers to the historical period of the Enlightenment, but also to sex education at the birds and bees level of instruction. Juliet is the heroine in the Marquis de Sade's Juliet, which was published alongside a companion novel, Justine. Juliet and Justine are orphaned sisters, 13 and 12 respectively, who end up learning of the birds and the bees in harsh, exploitative ways, along the lines one would expect from de Sade. Hence, Juliet is about Aufklärung under both definitions. There is a dialectical tension between the sisters, as Justine is sweet, virtuous, faith-filled, faithful, in despair, is always getting brutalized, and dies a premature death, while Juliet is an amoral, atheist, nymphomaniac, and murderer who is successful and happy in life. It is hard to explain the ugliness that Horkheimer envisions without entering into the sordid details Justine and Juliet experience in de Sade's universe. As the primary author of Excursus II, Horkheimer sees de Sade as the great philosopher who put the writings of Kant and Nietzsche into practice because he demonstrates, quote, understanding without direction from another. That is to say, he presents the bourgeois subject freed from all tutelage, unquote. Horkheimer dialectically positions Juliet as a negating, quote, primeval form of behavior which had been tabooed by civilization and had grown destructive under the stigma of bestiality. Juliet revives them in their outlawed, not their natural form. She compensates the value judgment against them, which, like all value judgments, was unfounded by its opposite, unquote. For Horkheimer, both de Sade and Juliet represent desired antithetical archetype forms of liberating tolerance. Yet, while Horkheimer praised the Marquis' liberation, he was silent on the actual terror of the tortured, bloodied peasant girls escaping de Sade's control, fleeing for their lives. From a reading of Horkheimer's assessment of Juliet, one can hear the resonating echoes of de Sade and contemporary left-wing political narratives on the family and related love relationships. Quote, the law, however, has been dethroned, and the love which was supposed to humanize it is unmasked as a reversion to idolatry. It is not just romantic sexual love which has been condemned as metaphysics by science and industry, but love of any kind. For no love can withstand reason, neither that between wife and husband, nor between lover and beloved, nor the love between parents and children. The Duc de Blanges announces to his subjects that those related to the rulers, daughters and wives, should be treated as harshly, indeed still more harshly, than others, in order to show you how deeply we despise the bonds by which you may think us fettered. Woman's love is abolished like that of man, The rules of libertinage passed on by St. Fons to Juliet are to apply to all women. Domonch voices the materialistic disenchantment of parental love. These latter ties originate in the parents' fear of being abandoned in old age, and the self-interested concern they show for us in our childhood is intended to earn them the same consideration in old age. Sade's argument is as old as the bourgeoisie. Democritus already denounced parental love as economic. Sade, however, applies the same disenchantment even to exogamy, the foundation of civilization. According to him, there are no rational grounds to oppose incest, and the hygienic argument formerly used has now been invalidated by advanced science, which ratifies Sade's cold judgment. Quote, "It has by no means been proved that children born of incest have a greater tendency than others to suffer from cretinism, deaf, muteness, rickets, etc." Unquote. The family, held together not by romantic sexual love, but by maternal love, which forms the basis of all tenderness and social feelings, conflicts with society itself. Quote, "Do not imagine you will make good Republicans as long as you isolate children, who should belong only to the whole community, within your families, whereas there are great disadvantages in allowing children to be absorbed into family interests, which often diverge strongly from those of the nation. Very great benefits lie in separating them from them." Unquote. Conjugal ties must be destroyed for social reasons. Children are to be absolutely forbidden knowledge of their fathers, since they are uniquement les enfants de la patrie. The anarchy and individualism which Sade proclaimed in the struggle against laws culminate in the absolute rule of the generality, the Republic. Unquote. For Horkheimer, de Sade's appeal comes from his willingness to dialectically assault all amicable, personal, familial, and social relationships with their antithetical forms. Horkheimer's liberatingly tolerant world is that of de Sade's, which further advocates the destruction of families and the promotion of incest in furtherance of statist demands for state control of children, claiming that they are the property of the nation. Scratched just beneath the surface of many left-wing justifications for federal aid programs, push past the flowery language, and one can glean the Frankfurt archetype form based on de Sade. Such negating constructs can only function to undermine a culture. It is a predatory, perverse, and dark worldview that has, nonetheless, informed narratives that resonate political issues to this day, made relevant by scientized claims of science from loathsome people. It is not American. Closing thoughts on the Frankfurt School. Wrapping up the Frankfurt School, from its beginning it has been a Marxist organization purely dedicated to the destruction of Western society through the ruthless application of Hegel's dialectic to every line of effort at every level of execution. Putting Hegel's romanticized vision aside, his dialectic cannot build anything but can only tear down. It is irrational. Marx recognized this, repackaged it as dialectical materialism, and made it the leading edge of his critical philosophy. Critical theory is a pure play on Marx's libido dominandi, to destroy. Critical theory simply brought this drive forward and operationalized it in keeping with the motto, Aufheben der Kultur, which signals a commitment to the relentless negation of the West, including America. In its current posture, the West, including America, is a repressively tolerant society in need of negation through dialectical processes of liberating tolerance in the form of others. The language of otherism dominates international and national discourse through imposed punishing narratives that intimidate to a level of conformance that leads to performance. Masked in the language of pseudoscience, it sustains a pseudo-reality capable of controlling its opposition to the point of being able to designate it as the defeat mechanism on which America is to be destroyed. It happens through the enforcement of narratives packaged as words that work in the prevailing cultural narrative that already executes neo-Marxist objectives. Later in life, Marcuse recognized Frankfurt's role in the larger Long March strategy and positioned it for that role. As such, the Marxist strategy has promoted the penetration and subversion of institutions, the subsequent conversion of those institutions to bases of operation, and the creation of agitation groups that enhance the role of the nonviolent main actors. In short, the left adopted a political warfare strategy, which is the same as the Maoist insurgency model that operates through penetration and subversion, creates counter-state operations from the institutions it captures, where the nonviolent lines of effort are the main effort, and violent splinters are created to enforce nonviolent objectives through the enforcement of narratives. This is among the reasons why the Maoist model is the preferred method for this analysis. Reaching back to Hegel, the difference between the competing concepts of science is that one is based on repeatable scientific method, while the other simply enforces imposed cosmologies through the enforcement of narratives. One concerns actual science, the other scientism, pseudoscience, or a second reality. From Woodrow Wilson's political science based on Hegelian notions of Darwinism to Frankfurt School notions of psychoanalysis based on Hegel's subjective spirit, which draws from hermetical constructs, pseudoscience has become dominant enough to displace actual science in popular discourse. Genderism. Returning to Karl Popper's concern for the non-falsifiability of the psychoanalysis of his time, it turns out that today, 64% of psychological studies from elite psychological journals and as much as 80% from non-elite journals fail the falsifiability criteria. This raises serious questions given the extent to which psychological studies are used to make enforceable legal and cultural determinations. Skepticism raises the question as to whether these statistics reflect a general trend within the soft sciences and whether those quote-unquote sciences have transitioned to a tighter focus on enforcing metaphysical claims to the exclusion of actual science. There is a demonstrable basis for skepticism. Just 4 years after Marcuse's decision to transition campuses to a counterstate role, Eric Voegelin, in his response to Professor Altizer, stressed how metaphysic-imposing scientisms were openly tolerated in the soft sciences of the academy, recognizing them, not unreasonably, as a form of alchemy. Quote, "I want to stress that the growth of a non-magical natural science in the modern centuries has affected the areas of science in which alchemistic beliefs are still socially permissible. In our contemporary world, alchemist magic is primarily to be found among the ideologists who infest the social sciences and their efforts to transform man, society, and history." This statement, however, is not meant to detract from Eliad's observation that alchemistic conceits survive also in the inspiration of the natural sciences, recognizable in such phenomena as the technological dreams of a new world, or in the biological dreams of producing a homunculus. Unquote. Quote, "In the present context, I cannot elaborate on these intimations. It must be enough to state their obvious implication. The contemporary disorder will appear in a new light when we leave the climate of opinion and adopt the perspective of the historical sciences, acknowledge the problems of modernity to be caused by the predominance of Gnostic, Hermetic, alchemistic conceits, as well as by the magic of violence as the means for transforming reality." Unquote. Claims of science based on the naked consensus among the scholars should not be permitted to share the same status as science based on scientific method that survives falsifiability. Healthy skepticism demands that consensus-based science be subjected to heightened scrutiny on the basis of its vulnerability to scientism in the service of imposing a competing cultural metaphysic. This is not as far-fetched as it may seem. As with Marxism generally, the Maoist model calls for penetration and subversion of institutions and their conversion to counter-state bases of operation. Marcuse made clear his intention to apply this model to the campuses. If this is true, and the Long March strategy has been in effect, shouldn't we expect to see pretty much what we're seeing today? The counter-state imposes counter-state laws with the intent of enforcing them. Are we not watching as campus-based counter-state narratives are being used to disenfranchise young students from the majority population, from their own institutions through a bundle of attack narratives like white privilege and Me Too, while the controlled opposition haplessly sits back and does nothing, disassociating such attacks on students from the attacks on their constitutional rights that they are? These students are American citizens at American institutions that are heavily subsidized by the government, if not state institutions themselves, suffering actual abuse from Marxist attack narratives seeking to deprive a vulnerable class of their rights, while political narratives are used to control the opposition, leaving it with a vocabulary that is incapable of articulating this reality. Regarding the controlled opposition, this is what Pieper meant when declaring that, when becoming trapped in a pseudo-reality, that they become, quote, not only not unable to find out about the truth, but also become unable even to search for the truth, because they are satisfied with deception and trickery that have determined their convictions, satisfied with a fictitious reality created by design through the abuse of language, unquote. This is the benefit that the left accrues for having successfully implemented and secured Vogelin's second reality that, quote, replaces the first reality of experience by the second reality of imaginative construction, and then endowing the imaginary reality with the appearance of truth by letting it absorb pieces of the first reality, unquote. So long as Marxists are ceded unfettered control of such narratives, there is only the possibility of limited tactical success on the road to strategic defeat. If the left has secured the campuses as Marcuse planned, shouldn't one at least anticipate the possibility of a slow conversion of the soft science programs to a leftist metaphysical support role used for recruitment, indoctrination, and dissemination? Isn't it a basic counterintelligence responsibility to account for such a Marcusean transition of the campus, or at least anticipate it? While most conspiracy theories, thankfully, don't result in conspiracies, all conspiracies arise out of conspiracy theories. As the student body fans out into the larger population, wouldn't one expect to see a lockdown on such narratives, leading to the exclusion of competing views based on the scientific claims they have come to monopolize? As manifest in America today, this is Hegel's scientism. Having secured control over who gets to matriculate, wouldn't the expected progression be to declare competing views as, quote-unquote, unscientific, while debarring the opposition from attaining any such competing qualification? As these scientized skill sets accrue legal status, shouldn't this be scored as a double-agent success, given that it will be leveraged against citizens? Has any consideration been given to the possibility that political science and sociology, both of which find their modern origins in the rising German state, are simply Wissenschaft in support of cosmologies that will always support the Socialismus? How doesn't this become an enforceable form of Gnosticism, structured to create entry barriers that silence citizen voices in furtherance of functionally debarring them from access to their own government? Isn't this what Marcuse said was the plan? So long as Marxist use of scientism to enforce metaphysical claims remains uncontested, there is only the possibility of limited tactical success on the road to strategic defeat.